welcome to one and all to this, I hope, very informative and exciting program. Over the next hour, we hope to help you readily identify and effectively respond to stalking in family court. And we hope to be a resource for all judicial officers who are interested in access to justice and in the protection of survivors of violence and other stalking behaviors. I would begin with my own introduction. My name is Laura Livingston. I'm a retired district judge from Travis County, Texas. That's Austin, Texas, the best part of the state, in my opinion. And I spent about 27 years in civil and family courts, have heard a lot of domestic violence cases and participated in a lot of general family disputes. And so this is a topic that is really important in the work that I've been doing. I'll ask next Professor Leslie Orloff to introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Leslie Orloff. I direct the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project at American University, Washington College of Law. And in that context, I'm also involved in staffing the National Judicial Network, which is also co-sponsoring this today with OVW, Spark, and New. So I'm very happy to be here. I practiced family law for 19 years, saw a lot of cases involving stalking, although we didn't really know there were no legal remedies back then. I started my practice in the 80s and 90s. And so this is a really important topic that I think will be of use to family court judges on the call and to the lawyers working in family and civil court cases. So I welcome you all here today. Thank you for joining us. Jennifer?
Thank you.
Thanks, Lizzie. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Landheis. I'm the director of Spark, which is the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. And I'll kick it back to you, Judge Livingston.
All right. Thank you both very much. I want to begin really with the way we begin many of these sessions by thanking our funders. We have received funding and support from OVW, and I am required to point out to you that the opinions that are expressed are those of the authors of this material, the three of us primarily, and do not reflect in any way the views of the Department of Justice or the Office on Violence Against Women. We are also supported today by the State Justice Institute, and the same admonishment relates there. That is, these opinions are ours and do not reflect the official opinions of the State Justice Institute. And so, Leslie, do you want to add a word about our OVW funding?
No, that's great.
All right. Finally, I want to encourage each and every one of you to consider joining the National Judicial Network. We work hand in hand with the network to present programs such as this, to highlight issues of concern, to talk about hot topics, and to otherwise network and learn from one another and help teach one another about the issues that we confront in our daily work. And so the National Judicial Network is an excellent way for all judicial officers to do that work. And so I would encourage you, if you know judges or judicial officers that aren't familiar with the network, please let them know about it. The information about how to join is on the screen. And if you want to follow up with any of us afterwards to get more information, please don't hesitate to do so. It's a really great way to stay connected, stay up on all of the important issues that you will confront in your daily work. And so we commend it to you for your consideration. Now let's jump right into the substance of our program today, which the focus of which is on stalking. And why do we want to focus on it? For my 2 cents, I'll say that we see instances of stalking, we see behaviors of stalking in all kinds of cases, primarily in domestic violence cases, but we see them in traffic court, we see them on the criminal docket, we see them sometimes even in probate cases where family members are at odds, or someone who thinks that they're entitled to something is chasing someone else. We see it everywhere. And our goal today is to help you identify it as well, and then figure out what to do with that information. This information, the risk factors that we want to focus on, the site for that is on the screen there, but what we want you to appreciate is that victims report experiencing stalking at a significantly higher rate than the justice system actually identifies. That means we see those behaviors, but it might not be the particular focus of any particular court proceeding. Stalking frequently co-occurs with other crimes and certainly is a risk factor for homicide. And for that reason alone, it's worth our attention. I also sadly need to point out that you are vulnerable. I am vulnerable. Everyone on this panel is vulnerable, and everyone in attendance today is vulnerable to a stalker. Some of us on the panel have been stalked. And so judges, court staff, lawyers, folks that work in lawyers' offices, all of us are vulnerable to this kind of insidious behavior. And the more we're able to identify it, the better we're able to protect one another. I want to turn it over to Jennifer now to speak a little bit more about stalking awareness in her organization. Jennifer?
Thanks, Judge. I just want to highlight for folks the website for Spark, which is stalkingawareness.org. And in particular, today we're going to spend time highlighting information from 2 resources that you can find on our website underneath our judicial officer resources. And those resources are a judicial guide, and which is a longer document, and then a shorter bench card that we worked with Leslie and her team to develop, and that we're really excited about the final product. And so we're going to highlight a lot of the information today, but we really want to encourage you to look at the website for additional information on those resources. We also want to call attention on Spark's website. We have a map with relevant stalking statutes, but also case law, not because we're doubting anyone's expertise on their own case law and their own state jurisdictional statutes, but because we also wanted to highlight what's going on around the rest of the United States. Some relevant case law and great information is included on that website as well. So you can check out that information if you have an additional question on anything that we're talking about today.
And Jen, if I can jump in right here, the other part of it is that some of us work in jurisdictions like the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, where knowing how to find other state stalking laws and what constitutes stalking in those jurisdictions can become really important, because the stalkers unfortunately don't stay within one location or the other, or don't, so those interstate laws are, and in the immigration context, we're talking about this, and I'm going to be highlighting issues for immigrant women, so that if the stalker, the perpetrator is in one state and the victim is another, from an immigration law perspective, whose stalking laws apply under what constitutes stalking for the U visa purposes, for example, could be either state. And so having this kind of a resource is really important in proving stalking for a U visa perspective, or, particularly in the U visa context.
And Leslie, you set me up perfectly, because one of the things we want to talk about today is the behavioral definition of stalking, and partly because we know we have attendees from all across the country and that the stalking statutes vary from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But the definition that we're going to use for our own understanding and grounding today is that stalking is a pattern of behavior that's directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to either fear for their safety or the safety of someone else, or suffer substantial emotional distress. And the reason that we want to use this particular definition is because we know that when victims are experiencing stalking, what they might articulate, what they might bring up in court cases, what they may mention to their counsel, et cetera, while sometimes it fits within our state statutes, what we also have to keep in mind is that broader behavioral definition of what victims are experiencing, and the fact that stalking can cause not only fear, but that fear is often masked by other emotions like frustration and anger, etc. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today as well. But we also want folks to keep in mind that one of the things that we oftentimes see in stalking cases is that depending on the actions of the offender, that the context behind those particular actions and the context of that stalking case is really critical to getting a good understanding of the safety concerns, of the risks posed by the offender. Because oftentimes what happens in stalking cases is there might be something that is frightening to the victim, but responders like law enforcement, prosecutors, civil attorneys, judicial officers, as they are hearing those behaviors recounted to them, it might have the reaction of, that doesn't sound overly scary, or I'm not really understanding why these particular behaviors are frightening to the victim. And so keeping in mind that oftentimes in stalking cases, specific behaviors have meaning because of the relationship between the victim and the offender, because of past history, And the other thing that can make stalking crimes especially difficult is that the individual behaviors in and of themselves that happen in stalking crimes are oftentimes not criminal. For example, it's not criminal to send somebody a text message or drive down a public street. Now, it might become criminal when we look at the larger context. And for the family court side of things, we also have to be thinking about a lot of times working on stalking cases is kind of like putting together a big puzzle. And we're often given one piece of the puzzle that without the context makes zero sense until either the victim or our client or whoever we're working with is putting that context into place for us. And so keeping that in mind as we're working on these particular cases is really essential. As Judge Living, oh, go ahead, Lizzie.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to add, again, putting it in context, and when you, some of that context, if you're working with immigrant victims, will have to do with culture. It will have to do with the party's history, but also in the context of the country they come from, what the respect, you know. So for example, I had a client once whose husband, she was most terrified when her husband would leave a suitcase by the front door. And, you know, that's a typical example of where a judge would think, it's a suitcase, why is that a problem? But actually was threatening to kill her. And it was because he was a member of the death squads in El Salvador, and he used to cut up bodies and put them in the suitcase. So when he brought the suitcase out, that's what it meant to her. So understanding the full context that Jennifer is talking about for stalking crimes needs to be, it's important when you're working with people from other countries, other cultures, and other, you know, different religious backgrounds, to think about how the perpetrator may be manipulating that as part of the stalking pattern.
I just want to add that, you know, sometimes flowers are the code for something else. Sometimes jewelry, right? Like you might think a choker is a lovely piece of neckwear, but to someone who's been threatened with a piece of jewelry, a choker is a deadly weapon. So you have to understand the context. You have to understand the individual relationship and the way in which these codes and triggers are used to terrorize and intimidate a victim.
Absolutely. The other thing that I want to bring us back to is what Judge Livingston opened us with, in that we know that victims are experiencing stalking at much higher rates than we're seeing through the criminal and civil justice system, and that the actual prevalence rates are that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men will experience stalking at some point in their lifetime. Now, if you think about the number of cases that you're seeing, say, of intimate partner violence, of sexual assault, and compare that to the cases that you're seeing that involve stalking, those numbers should be equal, and if not higher, for stalking cases. And yet, frequently, many of us are not seeing stalking cases as frequently as we are other violence against women issues. And so keeping that in mind as we go forward, and given those prevalence rates, why do you think it is that we're not seeing the same corresponding number of victims in our courts? And I would love to hear from some of you in the chat, or Judge or Leslie, if you'd like to offer your thoughts as well.
Well, while we're letting people write their responses in the chat, we got a question that I'll just paraphrase. The audience member wants to know how judges can explore these specific meanings and these manipulations and understand individual situations without further traumatizing victims. And I guess my short answer to that is that all of the work that has been done, which is sort of beyond the scope of our time today, but there's a ton of information and useful tips on trauma-informed courts. That's true for trauma-informed courts when it comes to the child welfare system and how we deal with traumatized children. There are also trauma-informed courts in every other context, particularly in the context of domestic violence and family law, because there's all kinds of trauma that people experience. So we do want to be, it's a great question, and we want to be sensitive to not re-traumatize someone, while at the same time, what we need, because we are an evidence-based system, we need facts, we need evidence, we need a story to be told so that we can make the appropriate findings, to including court orders that will ultimately provide protection to the victim. So you're right, we've got to be very careful and sensitive about how we get at this information and the questions we ask and the way in which this evidence is developed. And so there are a lot of trauma-informed techniques that we can employ to make that happen. But it's a very good question. ultimately, we need the information in order to provide protection to individuals.
And Judge, I would add, there was a question in the chat regarding, are there materials that we can actually use on the bench as we're looking at these particular cases? And so that judicial guide that we highlighted earlier on Spark's website, we'll bring it up for you again at the end of the presentation, as well as the judicial bench card on stalking that are available on Spark's website, are designed for you to be able to use from the bench. And they contain information about trauma and the impact of trauma on stalking victims. So we would absolutely recommend that you check out some of those things, because as many of you are identifying in the chat, there's lots of reasons why victims don't come forward. And Lizzie, I can tell you would like to add something as well.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to jump in to say that we also created, out of the slides that we're using today, a 2-pager, which is essentially a checklist of the kinds of behaviors that you as judges could document in your orders. So you may document, maybe what was the beginning of the pattern of what later became stalking in your court orders, because you have this checklist and you saw it in your case, and you might not have made the findings, but if you make the findings and the case comes back before another judge or comes back before you later on, that is another way to connect the dots. So documenting all of those. And we have that tool, which is a 2-pager for you that you can use on the bench, and family lawyers can use it as well.
Well, and we're looking for patterns sometimes, right? I mean, if you continue to see a pattern of behavior, it becomes less convincing that it's benign behavior. And so this documentation that you make in the court file and the findings that you make in court orders really are beneficial to help establish the kind of pattern that goes a long way to convincing a court that what we're looking at here really is a pattern of behavior that fits with the definition of stalking and is not at all benign behavior.
Right. That leads me to the point that we often make when we are working with law enforcement, but applies to anybody who's on the response side of things, that when you're working on a crime that essentially involves a course of conduct, if we're not documenting the first incident, then we never establish second, third incident, etc. And so we always encourage people to think about not only documentation for your own purposes, if you hear this case as it goes along the line, but if the case would switch courts or switch who it's being heard in front of, what have you put in place right now so that your colleague, when they get the case, also has the opportunity to know that you heard something in your initial hearing, etc., that sparked the thought that this might be a stalking case. And I think it's oftentimes easier to perhaps identify stalking within intimate partner violence, or when we talk about stalking, people say, well, yeah, you know, a lot of the intimate partner violence cases that we're working on probably involve stalking. But the other thing that we want to keep in mind is not all stalkers are current or former intimate partners. There's a lot of stalking that is perpetrated by acquaintances. In fact, almost half of stalking cases involve an acquaintance. So thinking about employment law and other issues that may arise in your court system is really important, in addition to family law cases.
I just want to highlight what Jennifer is talking about here, because, you know, as an administrator in my court system, when I conduct new employee evaluation or new employee orientations, this is something that we cover. If you have a problem with another employer, tell that employee to stop, and then report the behavior, but also report that you told him or her to stop, right? And document. If they send you an unwanted email after you've asked them not to, keep a record of it, report that to your supervisor. So it happens in lots of contexts outside of the intimate partner context, and that behavior must be stopped and dealt with just as severely.
One of the other things that can be really helpful when we look at these particular cases that involve stalking is to consider what we call the SLI framework. And SLI stands for surveillance, life invasion, interference through some kind of sabotage or attack, and intimidation. This work was developed by Dr. Logan out of the University of Kentucky. And what Dr. Logan did was spend decades working with victims of stalking to describe the experiences that they experienced at the hands of the stalker, what kind of behaviors were going on in these particular cases. Not surprisingly, most people, when you talk about stalking cases, have a tendency to focus on the surveillance behavior. So we know from research that both victims are more likely to identify that they're being stalked, as well as those of us that are responders, regardless of civil or criminal side of things, are more likely to identify that a case involves stalking if it involves surveillance behavior. Mostly because that's like what people think of as kind of the stereotypical stalking behavior, where someone's following you around or watching you, they're trying to get information about you. They may be engaging in what we call proxy stalking, where they're using a third party to gather that information. So be thinking about, as we're going through some of these examples, and I know Leslie was going to highlight a few that might come up within the surveillance category for immigration victims, but as we give these, keep in mind that the longer judicial guide and bench card have even more examples. We're just highlighting a few for you on the slides today. And I know, Leslie, you're going to bring up a couple of examples as well.
Sure. So again, for immigrant survivors, one of the things that typically happens, and this is why screening for immigration relief, providing DHS published materials on what a victim might qualify for at the courthouse, those things are really important, because what happens is the DHS, generally speaking, if somebody has a case pending before the immigration courts or before the Department of Homeland Security, one of the things perpetrators will do and stalkers will do is they will use that system that will say there's going to be a hearing at this time and place, and use it to stalk the victims. Violence Against Women Act has a confidentiality provision that is designed to stop them from being able to use those computer systems to do it, but they work most effectively for victims who've already filed an immigration case that essentially gets red flagged and shuts down any information out or any ability for a stalker or perpetrator, anybody, to find out that that immigration case that is victim-based even exists. But stalkers of immigrant women will use that. They will also use other family members and things like that in the same way that other people might use third parties, but when you're talking about people who are isolated and maybe less familiar or have less of a support system in this country, that kind of picking away or using those people as intermediaries is one of the things that we see happening.
Absolutely. The other thing that we know from research is that when you ask somebody who is experiencing stalking behavior if they're being stalked, most of the time they're going to say no, because many people have, again, that stereotypical surveillance belief about what stalking is, regardless of what they're experiencing. And so what the research actually will tell us is when we're asking specific questions about the behaviors, so things about life invasion, like is somebody invading property? One of the things to keep in mind is a lot of property crime cases are actually stalking cases, but they come in as the slashed tires or the graffiti or the missing things from someone's house or the unwanted contact at a public place. And when victims are experiencing those particular things and they're asked direct questions about that, then yes, victims say, oh yes, I'm experiencing that, but they don't necessarily identify that it's stalking or harassment. So one of the things that we want to be keeping in mind is questions about this life invasion or interference, where an offender might be trying to sabotage the victim's employment, interfere with custody, attack friends and family. As I'm sure you have some more examples as well.
Sure.
I'll go ahead and pause and let you interject those.
Right. So this comes up on this interference front. Well, first of all, some of it happens where it's more of the life invasion. For example, they'll go and find her at the beauty parlor or at the place or at her church or someplace that she's going that she's culturally safe. So you have that. And then in the interference context, you have, this is, immigration related abuse. He destroys her green card, her work permit. He destroys her passport. For those of you that are judges here in the US, one of the things that we don't often think about, but identity cards, like you can't walk around the street of some other countries, like many of the countries that my clients come from, you have to have an identity card or a passport or something to identify yourself. So what you'll see is perpetrators in the US destroy those documents as a way of trying to interfere with her mobility, to control her movement. What you also see is, people refusing to file immigration papers for her and threatening, and those kinds of things can be interference, or threatening deportation is a classic form of intimidation that immigrant survivors experience.
Absolutely. And all those examples and more that you see on the slide and that Leslie talked about, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that oftentimes victims are experiencing a myriad of these behaviors. However, what's brought to light are only the surveillance piece of things. And so asking questions about these specific behaviors, thinking more broadly beyond the surveillance behaviors to include the life invasion, the interference, and the intimidation. Again, the more incidents we have, the better we are to be able to establish a course of conduct. But keeping in mind that oftentimes victims won't identify those as incidents that they need to be brought up to their counsel, to the judge, whoever's hearing the case, because they don't know to bring them up. And so keeping in mind that oftentimes it's a little bit more complex, right? And I can see both Judge and Leslie nodding your heads.
I was going to add a couple of things. One is that we see some really obvious behaviors, like, somebody will put spyware on someone else's computer to check their keystrokes and figure out what websites they're viewing, or find out what their plans are and where they're going and so forth and so on. But some of them are much more, that's pretty obvious. Some are more subtle. They'll constantly interrogate the child by asking to speak to the child on mom's phone or dad's phone, or the child's phone that has a GPS function on it, or a track my kid's cell phone device, right? A setting, something like that. And so it's sometimes you get these really subtle things, and then the response will be, oh, well, I'm just trying to keep in touch with Johnny. Well, what you're really doing is trying to get Johnny to rat out where mom is going and where she's been. And so this kind of proxy stalking is taking place through your own child. So you have to be mindful and careful about all of those things. Some of those things, while seemingly innocent, it can be guarded against with a very clear and specific court order about when and under what circumstances one parent is to have access, whether that's in-person access or electronic access to a child, and under what circumstances that access can be dictated. So if you see a situation where you're putting in place some orders that protect the parent, you can also carve out orders that will prevent the perpetrator from actually using the child in an inappropriate way.
So if I can jump in here, we have a tool, we have a trauma-informed interviewing tool that we've developed for VOA self-petitions and U visa cases in the immigration context. Jennifer did some edits to it that we're going to finalize this publication. And so we're incorporating, for the lawyers in the room, or in the meeting, in the webinar, we're incorporating a series of questions that will help you tease all this out as you're interviewing with clients. Judge Livingston, what I'd like to ask you is, as a judge, if you see, as Jennifer said, you see the surveillance part, what could you do from the bench to try to tease out some of these other, just tips for judges about what you might do if the lawyers aren't raising it?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. One is, if you have a bench card, use it. If you have this toolkit that we're talking about and this checklist that has factors on it, use it. Those are wonderful tools to help you be on the lookout for the kind of behaviors that demonstrate stalking behavior, right? So become familiar with those tools and use them. You want to ask questions. I know there's a lot of controversy sometimes about, whether or not a judge should ask a question or not ask a question. My theory is that if I'm the one making a decision, then I want good information. And if I'm not getting that, I'm going to ask a question. And so if you have a question, ask a question. And the more you are trauma informed in the way that you get information, not interrogate, not cross-examine, not be the lawyer or the advocate, but get information that helps you as a judge understand the circumstances, the better, right? And so I think asking questions, I think paying attention to these tools that we're giving you and looking at the checklist and understanding the kinds of behaviors that we're identifying is a great way, and will go a long way to help bolster the findings that you ultimately make in your court order and benefit ultimately everybody involved in the case.
I think Judge leads us also into thinking about, in addition to those cases where you might, be especially attuned to stalking coming up, like intimate partner violence cases, custody cases, et cetera, the cases that you're seeing listed on your screen in front of you, cases that involve like identity theft. We already talked a little bit about property crimes, but we also see where stalking intersects quite frequently with sexual assault, sexual harassment. Leslie's going to also talk about issues that we see coming up with trafficking, et cetera. So keeping that in mind as well as we're working and looking to improve our response in these particular cases, I think is really important. The other thing that we want to be thinking about is, as we're looking at these intersecting crimes, is one of the, our tagline, I'm reminded that every year our tagline for Stalking Awareness Month is always know it, name it, stop it. And my staff will joke with us and will say, do you think we've moved beyond that this year? And just the know it, name it piece of things, I think is really difficult, especially when we're oftentimes relying on other people to bring it up for us, right? For people to name the stalking behavior. And it's so oftentimes not named. And it's hidden under these other particular issues. And I know, Leslie, you've got a couple of stories that you would like to share regarding some of these particular issues where it's arisen for you.
Sure, and maybe we can look at the trafficking slides as we do that. So I was working on a case once where, so this is stalking in the employment context. So this is, we're talking about an employer supervisor involved in stalking. This person was sexually assaulting employees. This was a meatpacking plant where it was definitely trafficking and stalking and other things happening at once. So what was going on is a lot of immigrant women, children, some adult males as well, where they would come to work in the morning and the employer would lock the door and they never knew when they were leaving, where they were going to work 8 hours or 16 hours. They had no control over when they could come and go. In addition, one of the foremen was a sexual assault perpetrator who had raped some of the women and was constantly threatening and harassing and doing all kinds of these behaviors to intimidate others into sex. That was part of what was going on. There was also physical assaults, but what was happening is in the day that people would get their paychecks, he would follow them home, different employees at different times. And so there was stalking behavior going on all at the same time in the workplace. And when you look at how, and it turns out that this was a human trafficking case. There was both labor and sex trafficking, and they were monitoring the employees. They were monitoring the victim to identify. They were recruiting them out of the same town in Guatemala. They were leveraging the information to sexually exploit and blackmail the victims. They were labor trafficking, like stealing parts of their wages, trying to trick them. The stalking partly was to get them to hand over some of their wages to buy this or that or the other. I mean, it was all of this stuff happening, monitoring them, making them feel more vulnerable, and we're doing all, so there was all this surveillance. There was also, I worked on another case of farm worker women who were being sexually harassed at work. And in that situation, they were threatening to essentially out the sexual assault to their husbands. So you had these kind of life invasion, humiliation, also seen that in human trafficking of young male teens, where they were being sexually assaulted by their traffickers. It was sex trafficking of young male teens, and the life invasion threat was outing them as gay to their community. So you also see, in terms of interference, you see committing acts of sexual violence against the victim, sharing sexually explicit photos, and then the physical assaults that can happen and were happening in some of these workplaces I was talking about is another one of these things. And plus, in the work context, interference, I mean, why are these people working? They're working because they have to support their family. And if they're experiencing these behaviors at work, that interference means they can't bring home money they need to feed their families. And so it goes a long way in terms of trying that power, that control over the victim. And then also with traffickers, and a lot of this to those of us that grew up in the domestic violence movement, it sounds pretty familiar. Some of the coercive controlling behaviors that traffickers use are very similar to what we see in domestic violence. You might see in the intimidation, they might be intimidating the person directly, physical or sexual violence, etc. So I'll turn it back over to Jen.
Thanks, Leslie. The other thing that we often see happen when we see stalking intersecting with intimate partner violence in particular is that oftentimes stalking isn't named unless the survivor, victim, and the perpetrator are no longer together. And one of the things that we hear from survivors frequently is that when they're together with the abusive partner, and that abusive partner is really jealous and they're controlling and they're monitoring their social media, they might monitor their behavior at work, they might do things to interfere with their job, they're blaming the victim for what's happening. When those behaviors are happening, as Leslie said, for those of us that grew up in the domestic violence world, we oftentimes are very quick to label that as part of the dynamics that happen in an intimate partner or domestic violence case. What we need to also be thinking about is that same behavior where the offender is monitoring and jealous and controlling, etc., is oftentimes stalking behavior. But very rarely is it named as stalking unless the victim and the perpetrator are no longer together. But it's stalking even if they are together. There's not statutes that say stalking can only happen when the victim and the offender are no longer in an intimate partner situation. And so some of you might be thinking, well, does it really matter whether it's labeled as stalking, whether we make findings about stalking as opposed to intimate partner violence? We would say, yes, both are important because we know that those intimate partner stalkers are some of our most dangerous. Those offenders who are committing both domestic violence and stalking are those individuals who are much more likely to escalate really quickly. They're more likely to use weapons. And these are the offenders who are not going to stop. No matter what the court order says, no matter what we've said to them, they're not going to stop their behavior because they feel a sense of entitlement to do so. And Judge, go ahead.
We see this in cases where we see repeated violations of protective orders. We see it in cases where there are repeated attempts to coerce the victim into a non-prosecution agreement of some kind. We see it in repeated attempts to reconcile, or at least to pretend to want to reconcile, so that charges will be dropped, orders will be lifted, or modified in some way to make them toothless, and so on. And the more they don't get their way, the more likely the escalation and the more likely the use of weapons, the reoffense, and the more they escalate the behaviors, but also the intensity of the behaviors escalates. So we get more of them, but also more dangerous behaviors that are witnessed and experienced. And that's really problematic.
And to that end, a lot of us have had the opportunity to receive information about lethality in intimate partner violence cases. And one of the things we want to highlight for you is to keep in mind that in 85% of attempted and 76% of completed intimate partner femicides, where a male has murdered their female intimate partner, there has been an episode of stalking within the year prior to the attack. Whether it was named as stalking, charged as stalking, brought up as stalking, oftentimes not. And so keeping in mind that actually when you look at the top 10 lethality factors in intimate partner violence, stalking is number 8, meaning that if a perpetrator is committing both domestic violence and stalking, that victim is in 3 times greater danger of being killed by that offender than if there was just intimate partner violence alone. But going back to the fact that oftentimes that stalking behavior isn't specifically named, nor are we specifically addressing it, we miss that opportunity to bring it up or highlight it as a risk factor in our orders, in our safety planning with victims, etc. And I can see both. Yeah, go ahead, Leslie.
Sorry, what I wanted to say is I can't emphasize how important it is that when you think again about immigrant survivors in particular, one of the reasons when we defined what is domestic violence under immigration law, we made it battering and extreme cruelty. And we included extreme cruelty partially because we understood that there were all these behaviors that make up stalking and that are very much like stalking, that were part of stalking, that were happening, that were predicting escalation, and that we wanted there to be an intervention. One of the immigration remedies to be able to come in and intervene sooner rather than waiting for it to escalate. And so stalking, like extreme cruelty, is something that judges aren't necessarily used to make findings about, but what we're trying to encourage you to do here is make those findings. make the findings of the pieces of the evidence, the things that can make up the patterns and can help you and the judge in that case and judges in future case recognize the patterns, because people weren't waiting for the first slap or the first hit for those things to happen.
Let me just add that even if you don't feel comfortable reaching the conclusion that this constitutes stalking behavior, what you can do and what would be most helpful is to describe the behavior you are seeing. If you have evidence of X, include X, even if you don't ultimately say, well, I saw X, I saw Y, therefore X and Y equals stalking. You can just say, I saw X, I saw Y, so that when the next judge comes, or when they reoffend, or when they violate the protective order, you can say, wait, there is here a pattern, right? Because we saw X the first time, now we're seeing it again. Saw Y the first time, and now we're seeing Z, double A, double B, and double C, and oh boy, now I think we can reach this conclusion. So even if you don't feel like you have enough to get to that conclusion in the first instance, documenting what you're actually seeing and making a note of the actual behaviors you have evidence of is going to be really helpful down the road. I think we've sort of covered that next slide, Jennifer, which we sort of been over. Maybe we should, in the interest of time, move on to the next one.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we also want to explore is the impact that the stalking is having on victims. And we know that one of the greatest fears of individuals who are experiencing stalking is that they aren't sure what's going to happen, not knowing where the offender is going to show up, what they're capable of doing, is my technology even safe? Oftentimes results in a very heightened state of hypervigilance on the behalf of the survivor or the victim. And what happens many times is people who are trying to ruin victims' credibility or make them look less so will oftentimes label that hypervigilance as paranoia. And they'll say things like, well, does it really have to do with the stalking? And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that as victims and survivors are changing their behaviors as a result of the stalking, many times they're doing so because they're afraid of the unknown. And one of the things we want to keep in mind is that oftentimes you may have someone, because of, as Leslie mentioned, cultural background, the way they were raised, the fact that they're a male victim, they won't articulate that what they're feeling is fear. And one of the things that can oftentimes illustrate that emotional distress or fear component are the changes that people have made in their life as a result of the stalking. So understanding what changes have happened in victims' lives, like relocating, they're not eating, they're not sleeping, they're changing their phone number, etc. All of those things highlight that there has been something happening in this particular instance that victims are fearful of or are experiencing emotional distress.
I'll just add that even if a victim cannot articulate that what she's experiencing or what he's experiencing might feel like gaslighting, if you listen carefully to the evidence, you'll see evidence of gaslighting, right? And the way you can sort of flesh that out is to listen for these changes in their routine. I used to do X, Y, and Z, but I no longer do that. I don't go to the gym anymore. I stopped going out to dinner with my friends. I stopped going to XYZ place because it's in a certain neighborhood or whatever. And so when you start listening to how a person's life has significantly changed, the before and after of it, right, really gives you a sense of what they're experiencing, even if they can't put a title around the gaslighting that's going on.
Absolutely. Leslie, I know you also had some specific examples from the immigration world.
So actually it was one of my domestic violence cases. And so I worked on a case years ago. It actually became the first case that went to Supreme Court on protection order enforcement back in the day. But this was in the late 80s, I believe, and DC had no stalking law at the time. And so, we didn't really even know what to call it back then. But what was happening is I would get phone messages on my phone at work saying you left your office at this time at night. I changed my behavior. I would drive back and forth to work, even though I only worked 2 blocks away, because I didn't want anybody to see me walking from point A to point B. And for almost 8 years afterwards, until I got married and moved in with my husband, I would call my sister every night to tell her I'd made it home, because nobody would know if I didn't make it because I was living by myself. So there were those kinds of things that I had to do, and that I've had clients do things like that, that we, can all be aware of, and can happen to any of us.
Absolutely. I think the other thing that we want to also highlight is when we look at the way that victims are coping with the stalking, we see that some victims will reach out to support systems, some will file for civil protection orders, they'll take advantage of the legal remedies. The one that kind of seems to stop people up a little bit is when we have victims who are actually making contact with the offender. And while we know that disengagement is ideal in stalking cases, because anytime a victim engages with the offender, the example I always give is if the offender calls 17 times, on the 18th time a victim picks up a phone and tells them to jump off a cliff, the offender would call back 18 times because they knew on the 18th time the victim picked up a phone. But so disengagement is ideal in stalking cases, and it's not realistic. What we know happens in a lot of stalking cases is that victims actually engage, sometimes because they're court ordered to, because they share custody, but also sometimes because they're negotiating for their safety. And think about it this way, if you're listening or hearing about an instance and somebody says, this person has been bothering me daily and they're constantly disrupting my life, etc., but I haven't heard from them in 3 days. None of us think, oh goodness, okay, that means the case is probably over and the victim's completely safe. What most of us are usually thinking is, uh-oh, what's that person planning? When's the other shoe going to drop, etc. And many victims will actually make contact with the offender to try to find out that information. They're doing a temperature check. They're negotiating for their safety. And that's one of the things that we need to keep in mind. And I think we've made some great advancements in understanding those dynamics when they're in play in domestic violence cases. But sometimes we forget that those same dynamics, regardless of the relationship, are in play in stalking cases when we have somebody who's concerned for their safety. Speaking of safety, one of the things we also want to highlight for you, and that's highlighted in those judicial guides and bench cards, is this particular assessment. And it's called the SHARP assessment, and it stands for Stalking, Harassment, and Risk Profile. And what it does is, it was developed by the same researcher that developed the SLY framework. And what it does is assess risk in stalking cases by highlighting 14 risk factors in stalking cases. Now, that said, we also want to call attention to the fact that victims are always better assessors of their situation than any type of tool that exists out there. But the SHARP assessment, and what research has shown us, is that SHARP essentially highlights 14 risk factors in stalking cases. And you can find more information online at coercivecontrol.org, because it's an online assessment that can be used to give safety planning instructions and narrative reports, et cetera. So oftentimes victim advocates, et cetera, will be working with SHARP to provide information. And SHARP highlights the 14 factors in risk factors in stalking cases. And we kind of lump them into 4 different categories, including the big picture. So it looks at the SLY framework, the course of conduct that's been happening in that particular case. It also looks to see if there's been an escalation or a potential trigger, what the nature and context of the threats by the offender are, and what's the offender's capability of following through with those threats. We also look to see how persistent has the offender been, despite our court orders, despite being told by the victim to stay away. What's their motive, and are they engaging in proxy stalking? Are they using that third party? Do they have a history of abuse towards the victim, towards other previous partners? Are they, or do they have access to guns or weapons or training on that? And it also looks at criminal history, mental health history, and substance abuse history as a risk factor, as well as what's the impact on the victim's life. Is the offender using technology, and how vulnerable is our victim? Do they live or work near each other? Do they share custody in common, etc.? And go ahead, Judge.
Well, I was just going to add that, I'm frequently hearing excuses. Well, I did what I did in that other situation because of X, and I did what I did in this situation because of Y. There's lots of excuses. And for me, the more explanation I get and the more excuses I hear suggest that that I should be worried about this. To me, that's a risk factor because they're starting, if it's obvious why you might have done X, Y, or Z, right, then I'm not going to worry about that. But if you have to explain to me in great detail with a lot of information about why you violated an order or why you did this or why you did that or why you didn't do this other thing that you were supposed to do, the more excuses and the more explanations, the more my spidey sense starts to tingle and the more red flags start to appear. And so I think these 14 risk factors and your common sense as a judicial officer really makes a difference, not to mention what the victim is telling you about his or her own experience with this perpetrator. All really important risk factors, and this is a very useful tool. I would recommend it to you.
Thanks, Judge. The other thing that we also want to highlight, and that's highlighted a little bit when we talk about the 14 risk factors, is to also think comprehensively about the stalker. What are they capable of? What's their history? Do they have a background in weapons usage? Do they have a substance abuse history? Are there things about their background or their previous behaviors that would, as Judge said, raise spidey sense in these particular cases, including things about the threats that have been made and what kind of threats have been made, what are they, what are those threats? What's the capability of the offender for following through with those threats? How are those threats communicated to the victim? Are they publicly put on a web page calling out the victim? Are they, voiced at the victim's work to try to humiliate, embarrass them, etc.? So keeping that in mind as well to give us that fuller picture of what the offender is capable of.
So
before we move on, let me just go back to that one slide just briefly, if we might. I think judicial officers are in a really great vantage point, right, to see kind of these patterns develop, partly because you've been making findings or your colleagues have been making findings that are available to you. If you are in systems and courts where we have what we call docket notations, right? They're not actual court orders necessarily, but they're a summary of the proceeding you just conducted, right? Those docket notations, some are handwritten, some are typed in. We all use different formats. We use something called Smart Bench, where we can document what went on in that case and what our thoughts are and feelings are. And those can just be available to other judges, or they can be publicly available. You can switch, flip a switch and pick where you want that to go. The point being that you can begin to document even before a court order is drafted, what behaviors you're seeing, what your concerns are, what questions you have, or what services you want to order people to conduct, right? Or access because of what you're hearing. And so all of that information is really, really useful as you move forward. But as a judge, when you see them on the protective order docket, and then you see them again in the divorce court, or you see them again in the child welfare system because they're, abused or neglected their children, we see them in all different kinds of contexts, and they reveal themselves to us through their behaviors, whether it's this case or that case or some other case. And all of that collective information is really useful to understand the big picture. So I just wanted to point that out.
No, I really appreciate that, Judge.
So this is the checklist. So again, the 14 points you just saw, the slides, the slides that Jennifer showed you a little bit earlier about the ways in which a victim is changing her life or his life because of the stalking. All of those things we've put together in a checklist for you that you can use together with the bench card and the resources. And again, for the family lawyers, these are things you should look at to try to tease out of your case, to both when you're doing safety planning with your clients, but also when you're trying to put your case together so that Judge Livingston or the next judge, the judge on your case, will have more to work with to make the findings. And again, whether the findings that document the stalking behaviors that could contribute to the decision-making that the judge is going to make in that case, whether or not they actually have to or actually find or say in their orders the word stalk.
I think it's a very useful tool, and I would encourage you to download the information and print it out if necessary so you can have a ready reference. You're not going to go look for the slides of this presentation and say, oh, I remember 6 months ago they were talking about X, Y, and Z, right? So make a copy of that bench card, look at those factors, and keep them handy in your bookshelf on your bench or in a bench card, folder someplace nearby, so that when you're hearing that kind of case, you can go quickly to the information and say, here's my checklist, here's what I'm looking for, here's what I think will be useful, and you can begin to refresh your memory with this very useful tool.
Great. Leslie, are there things that you want to highlight to close us out? That hour went by really fast for me. I don't know about anybody else, but
Yeah, definitely. No, I would just say that all of this information, and to the judges on the line, many things in the orders can be super important. They're important, to future court cases. They're important in tracking stalking, but they're also important because we have this battering or extreme cruelty standard under immigration law. And one of the things you should know is that when immigrant victims learn about immigration relief and begin to seek help, and particularly when they get to the point where they get work authorization, which happens 3 months to 5 years after they file, depending on the court case or the type of immigration case, what's really important is we really begin to see their lives shift, and they begin to improve their stability, their options for themselves and their children improve, including how they address the stalking they might have suffered, and how, the tools they have to move forward in their life and engage and help them and their children thrive. So we're doing stalking and immigration together because documenting these behaviors is super helpful to support the immigration case and to support what's happening in family court proceedings. And then the last word I want to say is we will have this webinar together with all kinds of materials we have for judges on a wide range of issues around immigrant crime victims, immigrant victims of stalking, immigrant victims of trafficking, and trafficking generally, all available in our web library. And, we're here for technical assistance. So we do judge to judge technical assistance, lawyer to lawyer technical assistance as well. So I'll stop there.
I think Brianne is going to close us out.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I want to thank NCJ, FCJ, and Brianne for hosting this, Judge Livingston and Jennifer for presenting. We are here. If you have questions, I'm sure you'll have as you begin to see these things now that you've participated in this webinar. If you have questions, Jennifer is available and her team to answer them. We have a team of judges at National Judicial Network who are willing to offer you support as well. And want to also commend you to look at the stalking awareness website. So thank you so much for joining us. For me, it's evening.
thanks, everyone.